The text arrived mid-shift, sandwiched between helping customers at my boutique. I'm leaving you, it read, and moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already emptied our joint account, it concluded, with a callous, almost gleeful ha-ha. My hands didn't tremble as I read it. My voice didn't waver as I assisted Mrs. Smith in selecting a scarf. The only outward sign that my husband of 12 years had just detonated our marriage via text message was a subtle tightening around my eyes. I waited until Mrs. Smith departed her purchase, nestled in our signature silver wrapping paper, before composing my reply. Good luck. My name is Alice, and at 38 I had just received the most contemptuous farewell in history. But while Robert was likely basking in the perceived glory of his grand exit, imagining me dissolved in tears over his betrayal, I was calmly locking up my boutique for the day. The signs had been there for months. The late nights at work that never aligned with his reported timesheets. The sudden, inexplicable password changes on his phone. The way he'd started hitting the gym, religiously buying new clothes in a desperate attempt to recapture his youth. 3 months prior, I'd discovered a receipt for a dinner for two at an exorbitantly expensive restaurant on a night he'd claimed to be working late. That same evening, I opened a separate bank account at a different financial institution. A week later, when he casually mentioned wanting to consolidate our accounts for simplicity's sake, I cheerfully agreed, simultaneously transferring my personal savings to the new account. The joint account he'd just emptied contained precisely enough to prevent him from suspecting anything about 2 months' worth of regular deposits. The rest was securely tucked away, along with meticulously documented records of every suspicious transaction he'd made over the past year. My phone buzzed again. Don't bother begging, the text read. Susan and I leave tomorrow. I'll send for my things later. Susan, the new receptionist at his office. I'd met her at the company Christmas party, observed her boisterous laughter at Robert's jokes, and noticed the way she touched his arm when she thought no one was watching. She was young enough to be his daughter, naive enough to believe she was special. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I called my lawyer, the same one I'd consulted 2 months prior when I'd unearthed the hotel charges on our credit card statement. It's time, I said simply. He just made his move. The papers are ready, she replied. I'll file them first thing tomorrow. Do you want me to have him served in Miami? No rush, I responded. Let him think he's won first. Another text from Robert. I know this must be hard for you. You're not getting any younger after all. At least you have your little shop to keep you busy. My little shop. The successful boutique I'd built from the ground up. The one that generated significantly more income than his mid-level management position. The one whose profits I diligently kept separate from our joint finances. I smiled, envisioning the certified letters that would greet him in Miami, let him savor his moment of triumph. I spent that evening in our house, my house since I'd inherited it from my grandmother, and kept it solely in my name despite Robert's repeated attempts to have his name added to the deed. Another fortunate instinct that had handsomely paid off. While organizing the paperwork my lawyer would require, I came across our wedding album. Robert looked so different then, before his midlife crisis had transformed him into a caricature of his former self. These days he wore shirts far too tight for his expanding middle, desperately trying to connect with the 20-somethings at his office, employing slang that sounded utterly ridiculous coming from a man of 45. My phone continued to buzz with texts from him, each one more condescending than the last. I've been planning this for months, one read. Susan understands me in ways you never could. You'll be fine. Maybe you'll find someone more your own age. Already told my family. They agree. We grew apart. It's nobody's fault, really. I screenshotted each message, adding them to my ever-growing evidence folder. Let him dig his own grave deeper. My lawyer would relish his casual admission of premeditation, his gleeful announcement about emptying our account. The last text caught my attention. By the way, I used the joint card to book our flights and hotel. Consider it my parting gift. LOL. Perfect. I immediately called the credit card company. Mrs. Rodriguez speaking, I said. I need to report fraudulent charges and cancel a card immediately. Certainly, ma'am, the representative replied. Can you identify the charges? 2 first-class tickets to Miami booked today. Hotel charges at the Royal Palm. And I'll need to remove my husband as an authorized user. Do you have documentation of the fraud? Text messages from my husband admitting he used our joint card to book travel with his girlfriend after emptying our bank account. I'll be happy to forward them. The representative's professional demeanor couldn't quite mask her satisfaction as she promptly canceled the charges. Robert and Susan would arrive at the airport tomorrow to discover their tickets invalidated, their hotel reservation canceled. My phone buzzed again. Don't worry about the house, the text read. I'll let you stay there until you find something smaller. I actually laughed out loud at that one. Did he genuinely believe he had any claim to my grandmother's house? Had his ego inflated to such an extent that he'd forgotten whose name was on the deed? Another buzz. And I know the shop means a lot to you, the text continued. We can work out a fair payment for your half. My half. Of my time's business. That I'd built, funded, and grown myself. While he'd complained about my long hours, dismissing it as a mere hobby, I poured a glass of wine, the good stuff I'd been saving for a special occasion. This certainly qualified. Tomorrow Robert would learn some harsh truths about property law and separate assets. But tonight I would enjoy the quiet and plan my next chapter. The morning brought a flurry of increasingly frantic and angry texts from Robert. What the heck did you do to our credit card? The airline won't honor our tickets. The hotel canceled our reservation. Answer me. I silenced my phone and headed to my boutique. Friday was always our busiest day, and I had a new shipment of designer handbags to unpack. Life goes on even when your husband runs off with a receptionist young enough to be his daughter. Around noon, his mother called. Alice, dear, she began. Robert told us everything about how controlling you've been, how you drove him away. He says you're being vindictive now, causing problems with his travel plans. I put her on speakerphone while I arranged a window display. Did he mention emptying our joint account and charging tickets for him and his girlfriend on our credit card? Silence. Then, well, he said you left him no choice, that you've been cold and distant. Patricia. I said I have his texts. Would you like me to read them to you? The one where he bragged about taking our money? Or maybe the one where he mocked my age? Another pause. He did seem a bit cruel, she conceded. I told him that text message was inappropriate. I appreciate the call, Patricia, I said. I've always liked you, but I think it's best if we end this conversation now. My lawyer has advised minimal contact with Robert's family during the proceedings. Proceedings. Already. Goodbye, Patricia. By late afternoon, Robert's sister Sarah was spreading family gossip through mutual friends. Apparently, Robert and Susan were stuck at a budget motel near the airport, their Miami dreams temporarily derailed. He'd tried using his personal credit cards, but those had been maxed out for months, another red flag I'd noticed. My lawyer called with an update. The emergency hearing is scheduled for Monday, she announced. Given his admission of emptying the joint account and the documented credit card fraud, we're in a strong position to freeze all remaining assets. Has he been served yet? I asked. Not yet, but he'll get the papers at his new motel address. Speaking of which, his girlfriend's social media is providing excellent evidence. She's been posting about their adventure all day, including some choice comments about you. I smiled, thinking of my own meticulously compiled documentation, a year's worth of suspicious charges, hotel receipts, text messages that proved premeditation. Robert had been so focused on his grand escape that he'd never considered I might be watching, waiting, preparing. My phone buzzed with another text. You think you're so smart, but I made copies of all the boutique's financial records. Half that business is mine. I forwarded the text to my lawyer, adding it to the burgeoning file of Robert's mistakes. Let him learn the hard way about separate assets and business ownership. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being prepared. The emergency hearing on Monday was everything I could have hoped for. Robert showed up in his new youthful wardrobe designer jeans too tight for his age, a blazer that screamed midlife crisis. Susan waited outside her youth, painfully apparent under the harsh courthouse lighting. My lawyer presented our evidence methodically. Robert's gleeful text about emptying our account, his credit card fraud, his documented history of hidden expenses, each piece carefully collected over months of quiet observation. Your Honor, Robert's hastily hired lawyer attempted. My client admits to some rash decisions, but Mrs. Rodriguez's actions have been vindictive and calculating. Calculating, my lawyer countered. You mean prudent. My client protected her separate assets and maintained detailed records of her husband's suspicious behavior. That's not vindictive. That's smart business. The judge reviewed my documentation, the separate property deed to the house, the boutique's incorporation papers in my name, only the meticulous separation of business and personal finances that Robert had always derided. Mr. Williams, the judge, addressed Robert directly. You admitted via text message to deliberately emptying a joint account and using shared credit cards to fund a trip with your girlfriend. Do you deny this? Robert shifted uncomfortably. I was just trying to make a clean break. By committing financial fraud, the judge raised an eyebrow. And now you're claiming rights to property that documentation shows is clearly separate from marital assets. Robert's lawyer tried again. My client is entitled to the business. It was established before the marriage. My lawyer interrupted. And Mrs. Rodriguez maintained strict separation of business and personal finances throughout. We have documentation of every penny invested and earned. I watched Robert's face as reality began to sink in. He'd thought this would be easy, empty, our accounts run off with his girlfriend, perhaps claim half my business in the divorce. He'd never bothered to understand my insistence on keeping things separate, had mocked my careful bookkeeping as obsessive. The court finds sufficient evidence of financial misconduct, the judge announced. All shared assets are frozen pending final dissolution. Mr. Williams is ordered to return any funds removed from joint accounts within 24 hours. But that money's gone, Robert protested. We spent it. Then I suggest you find a way to replace it, the judge cut him off. Mr. Williams, the court takes a very dim view of using shared credit cards to fund adventures with paramours. Outside the courthouse, I heard Susan asking Robert about their Miami plans. His response was lost in the sound of my heels clicking confidently across the marble floor, heading back to the business he'd never understood or respected. The next few weeks brought a string of increasingly desperate maneuvers from Robert. He tried claiming the boutique had been his idea. He remembered investing money in its early days. He even suggested he'd been my business partner all along. Claims quickly disproven by my meticulous records. He's getting desperate, my lawyer observed. His girlfriend's social media shows they're staying at her studio apartment now. Apparently living on a receptionist's salary isn't quite the glamorous escape he imagined. Robert's family started reaching out, their tone markedly different from their initial accusations. We had no idea, his sister Sarah admitted. He played the victim so well. But then we saw his text, the way he bragged about taking your money. That's not the brother I thought I knew. His mother called again, this time in tears. The things he said about your age, about replacing you with someone younger. I raised him better than that. I thought I did anyway. I let their calls go to voicemail. Their support might have meant something weeks ago, but now it felt like rats deserting a sinking ship. The boutique thrived, ironically boosted by local gossip about my situation. Women started coming in specifically to show support, often leaving with far more than they'd planned to buy. One customer confided, my assistant manager whispered while buying a designer handbag. I thought he'd take everything in the divorce. Men like that never expect us to be smarter than them. My phone still buzzed occasionally with texts from Robert, his tone oscillating between anger and manipulation. You've ruined everything. I never meant to hurt you. You'll regret being so vindictive. Can't we work something out? That business would be nothing without my support. I forwarded each message to my lawyer without responding. Let him dig his hole deeper. Through the grapevine, I heard Susan was having second thoughts. Apparently, sharing her studio apartment with a middle-aged man who couldn't afford his own place wasn't the romantic adventure she'd envisioned. The age gap that had seemed exciting during secret hotel meetings felt different in the harsh light of reality. She posted about toxic relationships and learning from mistakes. Yesterday, my lawyer mentioned during an update call and removed her relationship status this morning. I almost felt sorry for Robert almost. But then I remembered his haha. After telling me he'd emptied our account, the casual cruelty of his comments about my age, the way he'd assumed I'd be helpless without him. Instead of pity, I felt something else: pride. Pride in my foresight, in my quiet strength, in my ability to protect myself while he underestimated me. The final divorce hearing painted a vastly different picture from Robert's imagined triumph. Gone was his cocky attitude, replaced by barely concealed panic. Susan was noticeably absent. She'd moved on to a coworker her own age. According to office gossip, Robert had shown up in his old clothes. The designer wardrobe apparently returned to help repay the joint account he'd emptied. His lawyer looked tired, probably from trying to find loopholes in my meticulously documented separation of assets. Your Honor, Robert's lawyer attempted one last time. Despite the separate property documentation, my client contributed to the growth of his wife's business through moral support. My lawyer interrupted. Like these text messages belittling Mrs. Rodriguez's business as a little shop, or these social media posts calling it her hobby. The judge had clearly seen enough. The final settlement reflected my careful planning. I kept my house, my business, and my separate assets. Robert got his personal possessions and his car, which was worth less than he owed on it. "You've destroyed me," he hissed as we left the courthouse. "I'll have to move back in with my parents." "No, Robert," I replied. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure you couldn't destroy me too." His mother was waiting outside, ready to drive him to her house, his new home at 45. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd mocked my age was now living in his childhood bedroom while I continued running my successful business. "You planned this all along," he accused. "You knew this would happen." "No," I said. "I just paid attention. And unlike you, I understood the value of keeping good records." His mother stepped between us. "That's enough, Robert. You've embarrassed yourself enough already." As they walked away, I heard her begin to berate him. "Honestly, what were you thinking? A 20-year-old emptying bank accounts, sending those horrible texts." I watched them disappear into the parking lot, feeling nothing but relief. Robert had thought he was writing the ending to our story with that cruel text. Instead, he'd merely set my carefully laid plans in motion. My phone buzzed, not with texts from Robert this time, but with notifications of new orders from my boutique's website. Life was moving forward, just not in the direction he'd imagined. Part 3, Segment 1. 600 words. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my boutique had expanded to a second location. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Robert struggled to rebuild his life, the little shop he'd dismissed was thriving. I'd hired 3 new employees and launched an online store that was gaining national traction. News of Robert's situation trickled back through mutual acquaintances. He'd tried dating apps but found women his age weren't interested in a middle-aged man living with his parents. Younger women, having heard about his history through office gossip, steered clear. Susan had apparently warned her friends about him sharing screenshots of his desperate attempts to win her back after she'd left. His career suffered too. The company's HR department had launched an investigation into his relationship with a subordinate, resulting in a formal reprimand. The promotion he'd been expecting went to someone else, someone who didn't have a history of inappropriate relationships with reception staff. He tried to claim age discrimination. Sarah told me during an unexpected visit to the boutique, said they were punishing him for dating someone younger. HR just added that complaint to his file. I was surprised to see his sister in my store, but her presence spoke volumes about how thoroughly Robert had alienated his own family. I know we didn't support you at first, she admitted, running her fingers over a silk scarf. He played the victim so well. But watching how he handled everything, how he acted afterward, I'm ashamed we ever believed him. My lawyer kept me updated on Robert's continued attempts to challenge the divorce settlement. Each petition was denied, his claim of unfair distribution dismissed, based on the overwhelming evidence of his own actions. He actually tried arguing that his text about emptying the account was just a joke, she told me, laughing. The judge asked if haha made theft less illegal. The boutique's success brought unexpected validation. Local business magazines wanted to feature my story not as a scorned wife, but as a savvy businesswoman who'd protected her interests. Young entrepreneurs asked for advice about keeping business and personal finances separate. The best protection is preparation, I told one young woman who reminded me of Susan, and always trust your instincts. Robert's mother called occasionally, usually after he'd done something particularly self-destructive. He'd tried online gambling, hoping for a quick fix to his financial problems. He'd gotten involved with a pyramid scheme that promised fast returns. Each attempt to recover his former lifestyle just dug him deeper into trouble. I don't know where we went wrong with him, she sighed during one call. His father and I offered to help him get back on his feet if he'd just take responsibility for his actions. But he's still blaming everyone else, you, Susan, his company, the judge. I listened politely but maintained my distance. Their family drama wasn't my problem anymore. My life had moved forward, filled with plans for a third boutique location and a possible expansion into luxury accessories. The only reminder of Robert's impact on my life was a framed screenshot hanging in my office, his final text before I blocked his number. Have fun with your little shop. At least it'll keep you busy in your old age. Below it sat my latest business award, proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding on your own terms. 1 year after Robert's cruel text message, I received an invitation to speak at a women's business conference. The topic wasn't divorce or betrayal. It was about building and protecting a successful business. My story had evolved from cautionary tale to inspiration. During the Q&A session, a woman asked about keeping business and personal finances separate. My husband says I'm being paranoid, that marriage means sharing everything. My ex-husband said the same thing, I replied, right up until he tried to claim half my business in our divorce. Trust your instincts. Protection isn't paranoia. The boutique chain had grown to 5 locations, each more successful than the last. The little shop Robert had mocked now employed 30 people and had been featured in several national magazines. Through mutual friends, I heard Robert had finally moved out of his parents' house into a small apartment above a garage. He'd had to take a lower-paying job after his former company downsized, eliminating his position during restructuring. His dating profile still advertised him as young at heart, although his profile picture was hopelessly outdated. Ironically, Susan, a regular at my original boutique location, had blossomed. She'd earned her MBA and launched her own successful social media consulting firm. You inspired me, she'd once said, a testament to how a woman could build a lasting legacy instead of chasing fleeting promises. I kept Robert's cruel text message framed in my office, not as a reminder of pain, but as a potent symbol of my journey. Below it hung a sign that read, "Success is the best revenge." At the 5-year anniversary celebration of my original boutique, I addressed my employees and loyal customers. The space had been dramatically transformed from a humble little shop into the flagship store of a thriving business empire. Robert's mother attended despite not receiving an invitation. She waited until the crowd thinned before approaching me. I saw Robert yesterday, she said, smoothing her designer dress, one she'd purchased from my store. He was talking about his glory days, about the life he could have had. He still doesn't understand that he didn't lose everything in the divorce. He threw it away. I thought about that text message, his casual cruelty, his arrogant assumption that I would crumble without him, that I would beg break and ultimately prove him right about my supposed desperation. Instead, I'd built something stronger, something far exceeding what I had before. Each new boutique location stood as a testament to what women could achieve when they refused to dim their light for insecure men. The young saleswoman I'd hired last month, coincidentally, also named Susan, approached with a question about the new inventory system I'd implemented. As I explained the process, I caught my reflection in the store window. I saw what Robert had failed to see 5 years ago. Not a woman aging, but a woman growing wiser, stronger, and exponentially more successful. His cruel text message, intended as an ending, had instead become a powerful catalyst, a beginning not just for me, but for every woman who heard my story and realized she deserved far better than someone else's midlife crisis.